Hello and welcome to the Stormont Sources podcast, where we take you inside politics at Stormont and inside policymaking for Northern Ireland. I'm David McCann, and also on this bonus episode, we have our two regulars, Tim Kearns, who was former special advisor to First Minister Peter Robinson. Hello, Tim.
Hi, David.
And we also have Michael McKernan. He was a former special advisor to the SDLP. Michael, welcome back.
Thank you very much, David, and hello, Tim.
Brilliant. And by the way, Tim didn't say hello to you there, Michael, by the way.
That's because I did it in yesterday's episode. I just didn't think we needed to do it today.
He has one or two in the bank.
So,
Right. On the podcast today, we have a special bonus episode for you all. Sam McBride from the Belfast Telegraph is joining us to discuss his new book, For and Against a United Ireland with Fintan O'Toole. In the book, both of them make arguments both for and against constitutional change, and we will be discussing this with him on today's bonus episode of Stormont Sources. Sam, you're very welcome to Stormont Sources.
Thank you very much, David. It's a pleasure to be here. I've listened, I think, to every episode, so it's a great honour.
There we are. Flattery will get you everywhere with us, Sam. we are that shallow.
Better to say this at the start than the end.
Okay, For and Against United Ireland. I've read the book. Very intriguing. Obviously, we have debated the constitutional question on here. Funny, I mean, you can't really do a Northern Ireland politics podcast and not talk about it. But this is actually interesting. I want to ask you about this because, just for full disclosure, Sam, you come from a unionist background. Can you just elaborate a wee bit on that, just so we put all that out on the table before we get loads of tweets and messages saying we didn't?
Well, I mean, I suppose the main political knowledge that I have comes from my time for about 13, 14 years as the person who looked after politics coverage at the Newsletter in Belfast. That's the main pro-union paper in Northern Ireland. I actually don't come from a very political family at all. I drifted into political journalism. I wasn't involved in politics at university. I was more interested in reading literature and things that had nothing whatsoever to do with any of these questions. So actually, my own politics I hold pretty lightly, frankly. My interest is in getting the story, is in getting good journalism out there, and so that is really what drew me to this. If somebody had come to me and said, "We want you to argue one side or the other," I would have had no interest in it whatsoever. I wouldn't even have got to the end of that chat with them before I'd said no. What grabbed me about this from the outset was that this was looking at it from both perspectives and doing it in a way that nobody has done before. And I take no credit whatsoever for the idea. It wasn't my idea, so I can say I think it's a brilliant idea without flattering myself. And I think that there's actually something here, a seed, if you like, which can be used in other contexts to try to think through a difficult topic from opposite perspectives and then see where you get to.
And for anyone who isn't maybe aware of how the book is structured, there are 4 different chapters. You make the case for and against the United Ireland, and then Fintan O'Toole, obviously, for anyone who may not know who Fintan O'Toole is, he is a columnist based in the Republic. You both make the arguments for and against, and I just want to start with we'll be very BBC here. We'll start with the arguments against the United Ireland. Sam, was there anything about that case that really stood out for you in terms of the arguments, like for Northern Ireland remaining within the Union and for Irish unification not to be pursued?
So the central thing, I suppose, that stands out to me in terms of the case for the status quo, and actually when we think about this from where we are, I mean, I'm sitting here in Belfast, we're all somewhere in Northern Ireland. We're thinking of it mostly in fairly parochial terms. What does it mean for Northern Ireland? What does it mean for the 6 counties that now make up this part of the world? But actually, this is an argument for the status quo, and we were very much writing this book in the context of the entire island. So on the one hand, we're writing for people in Northern Ireland. That means keeping the Union. But if you're voting in Cork or Kerry or Galway, you're not voting to keep the Union for yourself. You are keeping the Republic as it is. And that really struck me, that people haven't thought enough about this in terms of there is a very appealing argument, I think, that will be made in the Republic. It will not be made by any of the major political parties, I don't think, but we've seen referenda in the Republic where all the parties say vote yes and the public vote no. I don't think that in these circumstances, given the weight of history, given the level of emotion, given all that has gone on in the history of this place, that will happen. But I don't think it's impossible, and I think far too many people glibly dismiss this. A lot of people in the Republic, I think, when you look at this, are probably at least in part going to think, maybe I should keep things as they are. Things are pretty good. They're getting better. We're getting wealthier. We're living longer. This place is going in the right direction. If we throw that up in the air and bring in these people from the north, what does that mean? And that's not where I thought that argument was necessarily going to go. I thought it would very much be focused on a Northern Ireland context. But the easiest argument in some ways against this is to say the Republic is booming. Why change it?
Yeah, and I think you actually did outline that pretty well, Sam. One more question for you before I throw it over to Tim and Michael here, who I know are keen observers and have been following this the debate around this book as well. The argument for Irish unification, and again, I thought it was because you're right, we're not often good in putting ourselves in the other person's shoes on this debate because we can get quite polarized. What about that argument? Was there anything that leapt out there? So advocating for constitutional change.
So I think that the way in which you approach this, for people who aren't ideologically committed, and that's really who we're writing the book primarily for. Of course, lots of other people will be interested in it, but they've already made their minds up. So it doesn't really matter whether it's good or bad or what's going to happen. They're going to vote one way or the other. So we're thinking of these people who are growing in number, who are going to swing this one way or the other, who are open-minded about this. And for those people, and this is not dissimilar to what happened in Scotland, this really comes down to your appetite for risk. It's about how much do you think you have to lose, and how much better could things be if they were changed. So fundamentally, I think that means that it's more attractive to people who are middle class or people who think they're doing well to stick with the status quo because it's working for them. They've got a good job, they've got a good life. If you don't have that, and we saw this in Brexit, you're much more likely to be willing to throw things up in the air and say, you know what, this isn't something that's good for me right now. Could it be any worse? And so when you come to this in those terms, there's an awful lot that will excite people who have an appetite for risk here. This is about creating an entirely new country. It's not about bolting Northern Ireland onto the rest of the island. It is about something that is completely different, completely novel. Everything is up for debate. Everything can be remade. That's incredibly exciting if you're of that disposition. It's something that really is a revolution without bloodshed. And there's not many people in any era of history, in any part of the world, who get to do that. We've got that chance. And that is something that I think for some younger people, for some people who feel like they're losing out, is really quite gripping and quite exciting.
Okay, Tim, go work away.
Well, it's interesting, and I said this in The View last week, and it's something I've been thinking about for a while, and it's something that's been patently obvious for a while, but it's not something that's really discussed, and I think your book has really been the first opportunity to sort of see this discussed publicly, how the script has been flipped. So the old arguments that we used to put forward, that were unimpeachable, you're better off in Britain. It's a poverty, ridden country to the south. The country that we're part of is an economic powerhouse. It's the country that has the wealth. And in many ways, those arguments have been flipped on their head. And I suppose where we're at as unionists in this is we're reluctant to be part of the debate. We're reluctant to be part of it because if we give it credence, then it looks like it is something that is inevitable. Because the one thing I think the New Ireland conversation has been very good at, they've been very good at convincing people that what's going to happen is inevitable. You either get on the train now because it's going to the station, or you just stay out of the debate and this is going to happen to you. And I think as unionists, we need to do a lot better at saying this is not inevitable. This is not something that's going to happen to us. There is a case for the union to be put. And I wonder, Sam, why do you think it is that unionist politicians haven't wanted to engage in that? Although we have seen today on Talkback, we're recording on Tuesday, and we saw today on Talkback, John Burrows, probably the first unionist politician I can think of to engage in this debate, has engaged in it today for the first time. What is it that we're reluctant about? Do we need to see more? A bit like Lee Reynolds and Pete Sherlow and what they're doing. Do we need to see the unionists coming out more and putting this? But I think it's an unimpeachable case for the union. But do we need to do that more? And why is there reluctance, do you think, to do that?
I think, it's actually quite simple in many ways. I think that if you think about this as a game of football, you've got a team that's winning 2-1, and the clock is running down potentially, and they think, why do we need to go on the attack? Why do we need to risk anything? We might lose something here. And so by having the status quo, unionism has this inbuilt advantage. Now, if you're a nationalist, you'll say that's terribly unfair. It should never have happened. It was a travesty of history. Set all that aside, because we can't change that. Whatever we think about that, it is what it is. And these are the circumstances that we have to deal with. But what struck me writing the book is that there is a huge advantage for unionism just by having the status quo. It's really difficult to change what we have right now on this scale. It was difficult for the people who were arguing for Brexit. They managed to just about get that over the line, we know. The SNP didn't manage to get over the line what they wanted to get in Scotland. And so if you're a nationalist and you're arguing for change, most people don't wake up in the morning and think about this stuff every day. Doesn't matter where their heart might lie. They've other concerns, they've other priorities. And as Fintan O'Toole was saying recently when we were talking about this, people in the Republic often say, this is absolutely central to my identity. You know, it's like the Irish language. It's at the core of what it means to be Irish. We aspire to Irish unity. But then when you press them a bit, it's number 15 on a list of, you know, other things that are far more pressing in their lives: housing, health, education, whatever it might be, getting a motorway between Cork and Limerick, or, you know, really quite practical things. And so I think that gives unionism the sense that it can sit back and just let this pass over. And already to an extent, there is a logic to that, because after Brexit, there was this huge disruption and it looked like things were falling apart. Now Brexit is starting to settle down, nowhere near perfect, but it is starting to settle. And a lot of that angst is starting to calm down. And what struck me was that when I read some of what was written 3, 4, 5 years ago about this by people from a nationalist perspective, as I was writing that element of the book, they were really gung-ho and saying there's this extraordinary conversation going on. Things are moving very quickly. Look at Ireland's future. Look at these big auditoriums they're filling. And when I was writing it at the start of this year, I was thinking, you know what? It looks very different already.
Because it does feel to me that, you know, the Ireland's future and whoever's been putting those views forward on behalf of United Ireland, they've done a pretty good job of having this whiff of inevitability, especially with sort of that middle ground and liberal-leaning unionists. And, you know, I was away to watch Northern Ireland against Luxembourg and Germany, and I got into a conversation with the Northern Ireland fans who would probably be sort of alliance-y, soft unionists. And every single one of them believed there was inevitability to an All-Ireland that was coming in the next 10 years. I don't think 10, 15 years ago you would have thought that. So, or they would have thought that either. So I do think there's something's happened post-Brexit where this has been somehow ingrained into unionist or certainly liberal alliance type middle ground unionism, where there is an inevitability of this, so we may as well get on the train. And I don't know, how do unionists counter that? And did you give that some thought when you're writing the book?
So, I mean, the huge gain, I suppose, that groups like Ireland's Future have done is that they've energized people into thinking this is achievable. Whether or not they actually believe it's actually definitely going to come, it's at least something that is somewhere within grasp. You can think about it, you can touch it, you can almost smell it at points. And there is something really quite significant about that. You've been, all three of you have been in and around politics in various guises for a long time. And the idea that Ireland's Future can get, you know, something like 1,000 people into a room on a Saturday afternoon when people are playing sport, when people are, you know, out with their families, when they're doing the gardening, whatever it might be, to sit and think and listen for hours about this sort of a topic which is pretty heavy, very serious politics. When I worked as the person who had to go to party conferences, it was always the worst part of the job for me. I hated it. I love politics. I think it's really interesting. It's really important. But sitting on a Saturday afternoon, listening to people drone on and on about how great their ideas are, it really gets quite boring. And Ireland's Future managed to do that. That's a huge, massive success for them. But I think the vulnerability for them and for Sinn Féin and for lots of other people on that side of this argument is that they haven't moved it beyond there. So it's simply at the level of, let's have the conversation. Right. You say, okay, let's have the conversation. What about these issues? The flag, the anthem, have a federal system. What about the future of the island in practical terms? And a lot of these people say they don't really want to have that conversation. That's for the Irish government. That's for a citizens' assembly. That's for somebody else, somewhere else at some future point. And that was one of the things that drew me to write this, because I thought, you know what, we actually do need to have that conversation. And it's not comfortable necessarily for either side to have that. But, you know, as honest citizens who are interested in this, we need to think this stuff through. Whatever the future is going to be, let's make sure we do it properly to the best of our abilities, not sort of wandering into something blind-eyed, which is what we did with Brexit.
I think, absolutely right. I mean, I agree with you, Sam. On a recent Stormont Sources podcast, I think I said I'd prefer to have a colonoscopy than go to a party conference. I mean, they are dreadful events. But for our two nationalists here in the conversation, David and Michael, I'm kind of interested, and it just comes on the back of what you're saying there. Fintan O'Toole brings out in chapter 1 the great challenges I think people have down south for an All Ireland to come forward. It's not that, there's this sort of heart message that's put forward. Oh yeah, sure, wouldn't it all be great if we're together? Now, you're going to have to pay more tax. You're going to have to deal with the flag. You're going to have to do this, that and the other. And your life's going to change. Oh, no. We don't want any of that. They're a bit weird up north. We're just happy with what we are. So in terms of Michael, David, whoever wants to answer, how do you think that's going to be overcome? How those challenges are going to be overcome? In the day when you have to make these.
I think those
arguments.
challenges will be easily overcome because the facts will out. And we heard a debate earlier today where people are arguing about where you're better off in the north and you're better off in the south, which health service is better, which is worse, life expectancy, and all these things. They all have to be addressed. Firstly, congratulations on the book, Sam. It's a great addition, I think, to this whole United Ireland debate that's been hotting up for a while. Not just Ireland's future, with a book. Ben Collins' Ex-Alliance as a book arguing for United Ireland. Leo Varadkar's put out a book, and he's got pretty strong on the subject. The BBC's going buck mad about it at the moment with Ian Paisley and Michelle Gillian. I don't know what they've got in their tea these days. But what I think you've brought to it is a bit of rigour and a bit of discipline and a bit of logic. And I heard Fintan the other night starting with first principles. Why did we have partition in the first place? What were the reasons that people wanted partition and didn't want unity? Are those reasons and justifications still there? And I think Fintan maybe missed this, but I think nationalists have to face up to the fact that those reasons and justifications were proven to be right at the time and in subsequent decades, where the Catholic Church and De Valera ran the Irish state in a very, way that was hostile to Protestants. However, as Fintan pointed out the other night, those problems, the fact that the North was rich and the South was poor and they'd lose all their money, the fact that they'd lose a link to Britain, the fact that they'd be swamped by the Catholic Church, etc. Those things have all changed. The South is now a modern, progressive, prosperous place. So that's changed. But in the dialogue that has followed, I think what this is clarifying is the questions that have to be answered. I mean, Tim said, you get these things thrown up. The latest one is that you'd lose your defence. Ireland wouldn't be in NATO, we would be undefended. I think that's on the table then. And any of those objections are on the table, including why does the South not have an NHS? Why do you have to pay to go and see a doctor? That's on the table. The Commonwealth could be on the table. Should we retain the Northern Ireland Assembly? That needs teased out. All of these questions about the economy, about health, defence, Commonwealth, even the currency, although I think that's an obvious one, they all have to be teased out and worked on. And I think nationalism should take a view that there is probably a border poll coming, but let's say as a working assumption that it's in 10 years' time. That gives you 10 years to plan. And for years I heard nationalist politicians go on about a new Ireland. I used to think it was a bit trite and meaningless. But now when I heard Claire Hanna and Matthew O'Toole and others talk about a new Ireland, which is really a completely new project, you mentioned this yourself, Sam, that when you think of it, it's change in the north and change in the south, and it brings about a whole new range of exciting possibilities. Just take health. We have a health service here that's NHS, but it's very poorly, very poor access to it. 500,000 people in waiting list. You don't have an NHS in the south, but they're getting closer and closer to it. A lot of people are on the medical card and get free healthcare. And the south is now wealthy enough that the south can afford to go to an NHS model. The south can afford to transform, and Northern Ireland can't afford not to transform. There's a perfect all-Ireland project with 10 years to work on it to get a new health system for the whole of the island. And the great thing about it is, whether or not there's constitutional change, that's a project worth doing anyway. And there's so many other sectors where you could say the same. So I think nationalism has a big job to do to set out all these arguments. I think the arguments are compelling. I think they would ultimately prevail in all those rational and logical arguments. And what they will then have to address themselves to is the slightly, if you like, irrational, in inverted commas, or emotional issues that have been caused by 100 years of partition in the meantime. And those are the ones where, even if I'm persuaded that I'll be better off, that the country will be much more prosperous and I'll have a better health service and everything will be better, I still don't want Irish unity, and I'm not going to talk about it. That's an emotional reaction, and I think nationalists need to think more about how to deal with that as well.
The most difficult element, actually, of the For chapter to write was why people in the Republic would vote for unity. And the most compelling reason I could think of, I suppose, was the simplest, that it gives them an awful lot more territory, an awful lot more people. So you've got a population of Ireland that would go up by about, I think, 35%. Its territory would go up by about 20%. Ireland would have a bigger population than Norway, Denmark, and places like Finland,
and
Singapore.
GDP by about 12%.
Well, that's a more difficult thing to get around, because that then involves the question of fiscal transfers and what might come out of that. It might be short-term pain, it could be long-term gain, all manner of possibilities there. But just at its simplest, I mean, just a few weeks ago, I was down a gold mine in the Sperrins, very controversial, but set aside that it's controversial, there's estimated to be about $20 billion of gold in the ground there. If you have territory, you have got things that are valuable. If you've got people, you have people who are valuable in what they can contribute. When you think about the NHS and the Irish health system, there are certain treatments that you cannot offer unless you have a certain catchment area. Having a bigger catchment area means there are certain specialised procedures that people currently have to leave the whole island for and go to Britain or go to somewhere else, which could be done on the island. So there are lots of these things that are actually quite basic, but we rarely get to think of them.
And Sam, let's see, we're all chomping at the bit now to get it. You see, Tim's triggered us. And Sam, just going off of what Michael was saying there about, it's interesting, two nationalists here, but I nearly disagree with everything Michael said in terms of the analysis of the constitutional debate. It's interesting we think of nationalists and that we all think the same way, and we don't.
That's because we've got somebody from the SDLP and somebody from Sinn Féin, so we'll have to let the listeners work out who's who.
Not a member of any political party, by the way, kind of stress. But Sam, in terms of you were talking there about, Fintan talks in one of his chapters about there's a difference between wishing and doing. And I don't think that the Unionist campaign or the New Ireland side have done enough of the doing bit. Even if you're a vote to stay within the Union, I still haven't heard Gavin Robinson or Mike Nesbitt tell me what that actually is or what that means for the foreseeable future. Same thing on the other side. So what that long-term piece of work, I mean, what is it from your analysis and from research in this book that you think has made not just Unionists and national leaders, but the British and Irish government shy away from just spelling out kind of a longer-term kind of piece for whatever way we go?
I mean, there is a fragility to Northern Ireland, as we all understand it. There's always a crisis either just in the rearview mirror or just around the corner. And so just bringing this topic up is seen by a lot of people and by lots of journalists and other people in our society. I was struck by the former rugby player Andrew Trimble recently saying in that BBC podcast that even though he's very relaxed about his identity, he's British, he's Irish, he's played rugby for Ireland, he felt a bit uncertain about even talking about it in that podcast. There is that instinctive caution about this topic. I think we're starting to move beyond that. I think we're starting to get to a point where for a lot of people, they are happy to talk about this. And Brexit has pushed this to the front of people's minds, where you had this very large, a mostly soft nationalist population in Northern Ireland who felt comfortable. They felt they could be totally Irish. They could play GA. They could learn the Irish language. They could speak it. They could be educated in it. They could vote for any nationalist party. They could do anything they liked, basically, that people in the Republic could do, but still have the benefits practically in terms of money, in terms of NHS, in terms of other elements of being part of the UK, without feeling they were picking one side or the other. And Brexit obviously turned that on its head. I think that there is this possibility now that we get some sort of sane debate about this. John Burrows doing that debate on Talkback is quite interesting. I mean, he may well be the next leader of the Ulster Unionist Party. He's clearly staking out a slightly different territory here to his predecessors, to the other leaders of unionism. But I think that the biggest question for nationalism here is moving the debate beyond saying, let's talk about this, to actually being serious about it. At the minute, often when I hear people from a nationalist perspective talking about this, it's not serious. It's a really simplistic, childish approach to just, let's have a united Ireland. Fine. What's it going to be like? Let's talk about the detail of this. So the central element of that is, do you keep Northern Ireland? And a lot of people will not even realise that's a possibility. But I mean, right the way back to the foundation of partition, there was the possibility that the Northern Parliament could vote, obviously, to join the Free State as it was then. You would, at its core, have had two entities, potentially. That was obviously then slightly changed in the next iteration of the Irish Constitution. We've got a different iteration now in the Good Friday Agreement. But if you do that, that is a different proposition to what most people in Northern Ireland think this involves. But we've no idea where any of the nationalist parties sit on this. They even the most basic elements, the most fundamental elements like that, they will not come off the fence on.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I think Ireland's future is kind of stuck a wee bit, even though they've done well to get big crowds into rooms. They're stuck a bit because they haven't got the answers to any of those questions, really. They're talking about having quiet conversations. And I think we've actually gone, that's Colin Harvey's dictum, I think we've gone beyond that. And it is now time to flesh out exactly what the proposition is and what the future would be in a new Ireland for all those areas that I listed before. I should mention that the failure of the independence referendum in Scotland came to that. It came down to the fact that they didn't have answers. They couldn't even say for certain what the currency would be in an independent Scotland. And we could fall into that same trap. But that's why I think the Claire Hanna idea, and supported by Leo Varadkar, to actually bring us beyond the likes of Ireland's future or citizen assemblies or individual political parties, but actually have a minister for Irish reunification. And I think, although I don't think they'll step up to it, I think there should be an echo of that in the North, within the Northern administration, where they at least flesh out these practical possibilities in areas like health and other areas, even if they're not, and not as a Trojan horse for the ultimate constitutional change, but just because these things are right to do anyway. And the time is now to move on to that whole agenda. And it's quite exciting.
Yeah, well, I think one thing, we're drawn to a close and we better let Sam go, but one thing we probably do need to discuss before we end, because I got into trouble from some listeners on last week's The View for this not being mentioned, so I'd better mention it lest the same people text me and tell me how badly I've done. So violence and what's going to happen in terms of violent conflict and the violence rearing its head again in Northern Ireland and across maybe the whole island, if there was to be a united Ireland. I mean, how serious, I suppose, is that risk, I think is the first question. I wonder, secondly, and we saw this in the debate today, Matthew O'Toole, when it was raised in Talkback today, about the idea of that his party leader had said there'd be civil disobedience at the very least. He very much got certainly very angst about that being brought up. So how much has that Brexit debate toxified violence in and around a future united Ireland debate? And your revelation, which I found one of the most stunning, I had to actually reread the paragraph because I couldn't believe it, that there's more loyalist paramilitaries than there are Irish soldiers. I mean, that's an arresting statistic. Now, as you quite rightly say, I mean, how many of these people are in their 70s? They're not going to be doing much fighting, but it is an arresting statistic to read that there are more loyalist paramilitaries. Is violence inevitable? Is it as inevitable as Leo Varadkar said violence was at Brexit? Or is violence something that might be short-lived and peter out quite quickly? How realistic is that violence, and should we be worried about it?
So what I would say about this is that while most of this book is written a bit like being a barrister, where you're arguing for a client and it's got nothing to do with your personal views. On this, I do have very strong personal views on both sides of the two chapters. And I live in Belfast. I've got a young family. I love my job. I love where I live. It's a great place to be. I do not want this society to burn down around me. My parents lived through that. Some of you guys lived through that. We know where hatred goes in this place if it's mismanaged, and if people cannot find a way to face up to very awkward realities here. And the most alarming thing to me was that statistic that there are about double the number of loyalist paramilitaries based on the MI5 PSNI assessment, which is now about a decade out of date, but it's the best we've got to go on. And I don't think it's too far off where things are, because we know they're still recruiting. Young people are coming in. They're being groomed into these gangs. They're being given weapons. In some cases, they're dealing drugs. They're doing all of those things. There's more than double the number of loyalist paramilitaries as there are Irish soldiers. Now, that in a time of peace, to me, just screams a problem. You have the possibility here that let's say if there was a United Ireland within 10 years, you don't train a soldier, you don't massively ramp up a military capacity in that period. And so already we're in a situation where we're ill prepared for that. A state has to have a monopoly on the use of violence. It has to be able to deal with unrest, deal with it decisively within the law. And at the moment, that clearly could not happen. And so again, when we come back to the level of seriousness in this debate, people like Padraig O'Malley, people like Brendan O'Leary, writing in academia, have dealt with this head on, have said, if you're serious about this, the Irish military need to be recruiting informers within loyalist organisations. They need to be drastically scaling up their naval resources. We know that guns came into this island in the early 1900s through Larne, through other ports. We know that now people can fly drones in. There are massive vulnerabilities here, obvious vulnerabilities. And yet, when I've written about this, but in the Sunday Independent, the Belfast Telegraph, often the backlash comes from a lot of people within republicanism saying, how dare you suggest that people might be violent on this island? You're encouraging them. You're secretly hoping this happens. I mean, that is not just outrageous and absurd, but it actually is quite scary. If that is genuinely what people think, that we can't even talk about the possibility of violence, we're never going to confront it. Those people need to be faced down. We cannot have a situation where he who has the biggest gun decides that he'll bully everybody else into what's going to happen here. That's not democratic. That's not the society I want to live in. But I want a situation where those people will be dealt with decisively if they're undemocratic in their means. And at the moment, that will not happen.
And
yeah, but
then,
I think it's a wee bit depressing that we're thinking in terms of the resistance to the reunification of Ireland could mean that the Irish Army should be ramping up now, ready for the violent reaction and so on. I think that's overly pessimistic. I think we've 10 years to persuade people to win all the practical arguments and then address the emotional ones. And I think you can persuade people. Dire consequences were threatened with the Northern Ireland Protocol, and people did take to the streets, and there was a bit of disorder. But, it's gone.
So this is more than
Michael,
that. This is more than that. Yeah.
Think about this from the logic of somebody who is a loyalist paramilitary, and I'm not sympathetic to what they do, but think about it from their perspective for a second. A bit like what I've done in this book, thinking about the two sides of a difficult question. If you're a loyalist paramilitary, the only justification for your continued existence is as a sort of doomsday protectorate for the unionist population in Northern Ireland. That if they are, as they would see it, unfairly taken out of the union, that you will step in and protect these areas or try to save the union, which is what they think their forefathers did back in 1912 and in that period around the time of partition. And what strikes me about this is that at the time of the Ulster Covenant centenary in Northern Ireland, almost every unionist, from the most liberal all the way through to the most hardline, venerated what their ancestors did at that time, which was undemocratic, you could say, which brought guns into this island, which threatened to take His Majesty's forces on with weaponry in a way that you could say was treasonous, because they said that was the right thing to do. So that's the ancestral memory here. And if those people think that and believe that, which I think they do, I think there is a genuine belief in that, I think it's quite logical for them, if they think that they're being taken out of the union against their wishes, if it's being done unfairly as they see it, if, for instance, there is a very contested outcome here, we know what Donald Trump did in the US, where he managed to persuade people that he'd lost an election, which he hadn't lost. Here we've had a history of vote stealing. We've had allegations even within nationalism in the last decade that people have been stealing votes. That is a very obvious problem that has to be addressed. We saw it with Brexit, dark money allegations, claims people had been lied to. too. But as bad as that was, Remainers were never going to set off bombs in the middle of London. Here, that is what people resort to. We know that historically. We can't get away from that. I'm not encouraging that. I don't want that. I might be, or my family might be, the sort of people who get caught up and get blown up in those bombs, as any of us could be. That's not the solution, but we need to address that. And while it might seem pessimistic to say you need to have a serious armed alternative to that, armies prepare for things that they hope never come true. And that's what has to happen here.
Yeah, no, I just think that our loyalists will be pragmatic and they'll see better health service, better benefits.
Michael, that's naive.
And not much changing in their day-to-day life. That the resistance,
Michael,
yes, there'll be some resistance, but it'll not be back to 1912, you know.
Yeah, but Michael, how did that work out with? I mean, there were assessments within unionism in the 1960s, early 60s. Well, we've beaten the IRA; they'll never ever come back. The border campaign was a disaster, and by 1969, 1970. I'm not saying that, but I do think the Irish government do need to be ready for it.
They had to swallow the Parades Commission, and that was do or die. That's all gone. But the flag coming down from the frequency of the flag reducing the Belfast City Hall, that was dire consequences, and it's all dealt with.
This is different.
And the Northern Ireland Protocol the same.
As Sam has said there, the only reason for a loyalist paramilitary to exist right now is to defend Northern Ireland. And if that's taken away, then the gloves are off. I mean, this is your last round. This is Custer's last stand. And that's really what it is. So, I mean, I just think that that's a naive view to think, well, look, they'll say they've got a health service. Dundonald Hospital's still open, so they can get a hip replacement, so it'll all be okay. I think there is no other reason for them to exist beyond the unity debate. So,
of course, they shouldn't exist anyway.
Of course, well, none of us don't want them to exist, and none of us want this to happen.
And there's 10 years. Yeah. There's 10 years to try and get rid of them.
And there's also 10 years for them to try and sabotage the whole, because Irish unity will be a process. It's not going to happen over one day. They'll use that as a process to try and make people think again in the Republic. And again, look, we shouldn't listen to it. We should. They should not influence any decision. But I do think it is a bit naive, though. It is a bit naive, though, to think that
the strongest argument for the union and for not changing is the loyalist backlash.
Absolutely, which is really dangerous because for
not.
Some politicians, they will absolutely lean into that in a really reckless way. We know that people care about this passionately on both sides, and if they think that gets them an advantage, there will be politicians who will absolutely talk this up, and that's what scares me. That if we don't take this seriously, if you're wrong, Michael, we're in deep difficulty. If I'm wrong, we've just wasted a lot of money, or rather, the Irish state has wasted a lot of money on soldiers they're never going to need. I know which of those I'd rather have.
Yeah, and look, just on, because I don't want to depress listeners too much.
We can't finish on that discussion of violence, David.
We can't finish on the discussion of violence,
more positive.
But I want to talk. But I want to talk to you a little bit, because you were talking, and we've spoken about this before, Sam, about a contested. It just occurred to me. I was writing in the Irish News this week. This month is the 30th anniversary of the 1995 Quebec referendum, where Canada came within 1 point of not existing, because Quebec was going to leave. But back then, both sides accepted the result, even though it was razor thin. It was a razor thin no victory. But we didn't have social media then. We didn't have the disinformation campaign then. What do we do for both sides? Like, what if it's like 50.5 to stay in the union and 49.5 to leave, or vice versa? Because that is the nightmare scenario here, that you have a 95 Quebec style scenario where it's massive turnout and you're just within a few thousand votes of either outcome prevailing.
Well, just before I come on to the positive element of this, let me say that the violent element actually cuts both ways, because if you get a situation where Republicans think that they have unfairly lost, that there's been vote stealing or dark money or British interference or meddling or whatever it might be, you've got dissident Republicans who right now are very, very tightly squeezed, but some of those people will say, look, we always told you this would never work. We got this border poll. These guys didn't play by the rules. So there is a real vulnerability there. And it's one of the reasons why the idea of just rushing into this, saying, you know what, let's pick a date, 2030. Let's just do it at 2030. It's a really stupid, reckless, ludicrous way to take on something which is a serious idea that needs to be thought about seriously. So The 7-year rule is sometimes misunderstood as it has to be every 7 years, which it doesn't, but it has to be every 7 years if there's evidence that people still feel the way they did at the point where it was held, which I think there's a good chance that they would, at least for another go. And so that, to me, again, when I was thinking about this from both perspectives, on either side of the border, I think that makes it easier to vote no than vote yes in the short term, because it's not final. And so you're saying potentially in the Republic, let's say, I'm all on for this. Great idea. Let's have unity. I want to do what my ancestors, would love me to have done, but we're not quite there yet. Let's do another 7 years of planning. We'll go again. We'll do it that time. The danger, of course, is that the world could change completely in 7 years. It might be that there's massive economic disruption, or there's a global war. Like there are any number of things that could intervene in that period. So it's not certain for either side there, but it means that it's easier to say that. But the benefit, I think, wearing my other hat, of voting yes for Irish unity is that it does bring finality. That this is something that has vexed this island for centuries, not partition obviously as it now is, but this question of how Irish affairs are organised, of the role of Britain on this island, has dragged down a lot of what might have come out of this place. There's been a lot of energy wasted, a lot of blood wasted, a lot of treasure squandered, and actually this would bring it to an end once and for all. If there is a vote for Irish unity, there is no going back. This is it. You cannot have a territory that flip-flops its sovereignty between two jurisdictions. And so that would mean that, yes, some unionists would be unhappy. Some of them might be violent. Some of them would leave. There'd be all sorts of possible problems, but there would be a clarity to this. And then things could move on. And that has a pretty compelling logic to it on that side of the argument.
And my final question is actually not to you, Sam, but to Tim, because you just remind me, Arlene Foster said when she was DUP leader, if there was a vote for United, she would leave. She would leave Northern Ireland. What about you, Tim? Would you? And I know a couple of people in the DUP and the UP have told me, David, to be honest with you, I'll be no bother because I'll be on the first plane or boat out of here. So what about you, Tim?
Well, probably like you, David, I'll just go wherever there's Diet Coke. I mean, as long as that's in the place where we are. But look, I mean, I think this argument is ultimately ridiculous, because who knows where anybody's going to be. I mean, I have two kids; they're Canadian. I mean, they could be in Canada. You'll go where your kids and your grandkids are. So I mean, it's just it's impossible to say where will I be in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years.
You'll move to Quebec and they'll vote to leave.
The only thing we can comfort ourselves in is this, David. It's not going to happen.
There we are. And on Tim putting his fingers in his ears, thanks for telling Sam and Fintan they've just wasted their time doing this, by the way.
Oh, no. It's a very interesting academic exercise. Please
how come you haven't met Sam? How come you actually haven't met Sam, given that you both feature so splendidly in the world of renewable heat?
I thought that was going to be passed by, but yes.
I think we need to bracket here, Callum, that the listeners don't know I said that. So that's maybe a cutting an edit there.
Well, look, we'll get Sam back, because the next year's the 10th anniversary of the RHI debacle. So
I was going to say,
look forward to it.
Sam, I thought for once I was going to get away with not hearing about RHI, but you had to get a paragraph in.
So I should just finally make clear that I did not pay Tim to say in The View about, I think 4 times, people should go out and buy this book. So first it was unionists should go out and buy this book. Then it was everyone should buy this book. Then I think it was something else. I was sitting on the sofa with my wife saying, I did not give him anything. I mean, what is going on here? He's not part of the marketing team.
I mean, that mystery £5,000 donation into my bank account was very gratefully received.
Well, look, I will say it. I think people should go out and buy the book. So the book is For and Against the United Ireland by Fintan O'Toole, Sam McBride. It really is a good piece of work, Sam. Well done to you and Fintan for putting it together. And thank you for coming on to Stormont Sources.
Thanks very much, David.
Thank you.
Okay, that's all we have time for this bonus edition of Stormont Sources. Thank you very much for listening. We'll be back on our usual Thursday slot next week. We'll see you then.